Hello, I'm just doing a few bits and pieces with the slides. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ali Garrett and I am the CX Director at Isentia. Thank you for joining us for our Isentia Conversations Communicating Through Change webinar today. We've been running these webinars since March and we have been communicating through a whole lot of change, a whole lot of things that have happened, and even week to week, fortnight to fortnight, there's been so much that is going on. A little bit of housekeeping at the top of the session. We have muted all of your microphones today. So if you try and unmute, that's not something you're going to be able to do. We're just trying to avoid that background noise funkiness, especially as we all start to recover. Our streets and our neighbourhoods are getting a little bit busier. But that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you today. We've got time at the end of the session today to answer your questions and for our wonderful panelists to be able to talk in more detail about some of the concepts that they're sharing today. So please leave any questions that you have just in that chat area, which should be on that go to webinar pop-up. I think right on cue, we just got a little bit of traffic noise from one of our panelists, which is absolutely illustrating my point about us moving towards recovery and starting to have busier neighbourhoods. So now it feels like an excellent time to introduce you to who we're going to be hearing from today and the faces that you're seeing on screen. So today we're going to be talking to Amitai Levy's Stella Muller. So Stella is the Chief of Enlightenment, which I've got to say is a very fantastic job title, and the Director of Bright Sunday. And Stella has worked in marketing, communications and advertising for nearly 15 years and worked across government agencies, the private sector and NGO as well. Stella has also worked across the Pacific region on projects relating to labour mobility, trade and economic development. And I want to tell you a little bit about Bright Sunday as well, because that's really going to inform some of the stories that Stella is going to be sharing with us today. So Stella established Bright Sunday, which was formerly known as 4PI Marketing Communications. And that was a response to seeing the growing need for Pacifica and Māori people to take a lead in developing their own narratives and leading and informing marketing campaigns. And some of the cool stuff that they've worked on includes things like the Pacific Fusion Fashion Show and a whole bunch of initiatives with government departments, like Power Up with the Ministry of Education and the Pacifica Proud initiative with MSD as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, Stella. And for those of you who've been joining these sessions with us for the last couple of months, Ngaire will be a familiar face to you, but I know we've got some new attendees today. So let me introduce you to Ngaire and her gorgeous brain. So Ngaire is our Insights Director for Australia and New Zealand at Isentia. So that means that she is the brains behind our media research division and runs that piece. Ngaire is also really passionate about communication, and over the last couple of months we've been looking at what communication has been working well, but also what we're seeing in the media. So Ngaire is the chair of the Global Young Leaders Group for AMEC, which is the International Association for the Measurement and Education of Communication. So she's going to share some of those thoughts as well. And I'm conscious today that both of our panelists are, I'm in Sydney, both of our panelists are in New Zealand, and in a world that is starting to look very normal. Ngaire, how is level 1 going? How are you?
It's good. I don't have to be 1.5 meters away from people anymore, so that's quite nice.
That sounds exciting.
No,
what
it's
have you
really
been
good.
seeing over the last couple of weeks since we last spoke? If we're talking about change, what change are you seeing?
Well, yeah, media has become very, very interesting, more interesting than it already was with coronavirus. Obviously, media narratives have really shifted into a massive global social change movement as well. So what the mainstream media is talking about, particularly in this part of the world, for Australia particularly, is the relationship between Australia and China is getting a lot of attention for various political reasons. But certainly the notion of police behaviour and systemic racism across the world is another huge topic. There continues to be a lot of concern for the global economic recovery, and there's a little bit about life after restrictions, which is a little bit more of a New Zealand topic at the moment. We're in sort of our first week of returning to full normal. But the huge difference between, I guess, mainstream media narratives and social media narratives at the moment is obviously that the Black Lives Matter movement has opened up this really significant dialogue about white privilege and police targeting and police systems across the world. And I think for communicators, it's incredibly important to watch what's happening in the US, particularly for social media. I've been saying, I think throughout the whole time we've been doing these webinar series about needing to be able to read the room and understanding what it is that drives people to really emotionally comment on things online. And one of the really interesting things that's happening right now is that brands are being very explicitly called on to have a position and have a view and make that known, which isn't typically what you would expect. Silence in any form from anyone in this context is viewed as being complicity. In terms of what people are looking for, because it's the other thing I like to look at, I'm unfortunately have to talk about Pete Evans again, which I had to talk about him a couple of weeks ago, but because of a 60 Minutes interview, which is very interesting if nobody's watched that. He was a pretty high Google trend again. Some of these other things are really indicative of life returning to normal outside of that kind of massive social change discussion. So things like the AFL and the launch of the PlayStation 5 and the other the lingering kind of COVID topic is really around wage subsidies and economic recovery. I'm going to flick to the next slide, Ellie. In terms of what I think a lot of this means for communicators, clarity is something we've talked about a few times in these sessions, and the need to be clear, but I want to expand this definition a little bit to not only being clear about what you say, but being very clear about what you stand for. I would really encourage people to consider expanding what their view of crisis communication and crisis communication planning is, and include that idea of response to social issues and social change. And whether or not you know what your organisational response would be should you be called on to have one. And also constantly evaluate how inclusive your communications are, how inclusive is your creative, how inclusive are you in the way that the words that you choose. Audiences are constantly shifting and moving, and you have to really regularly evaluate what you think your audience is, and constantly challenge what it is that you think that you know. And also know your organisational history. Is there a risk in there that you should consider and plan for? One of the things that is really happening at the moment is having to restrict media or scrub media from streaming platforms because they're no longer appropriate. How far that kind of context might go is hard to tell. There's a history of looking back at previous tweets or previous stances that will continue to be a trend online. So do make sure you're across if your company has ever taken a stance. If it's a stance that you shouldn't necessarily be proud of, just try and incorporate some of that into your risk and crisis planning if you can. Something to watch, because this is something that I think is going to get really interesting, and especially when in a media environment, media aren't always thinking about the long-term impact of a narrative. They're thinking about a story right now. They're not necessarily thinking about what that means en masse. So there is this kind of growing issue that will come between that nationalist tension and this broad sweeping social change. So borders are still closed, especially in this part of the world. So the longer they remain closed, the longer that kind of really protectionist and nationalist ideology can really exist. And that is at a really interesting juxtaposition to the kind of wonderful broad conversation about white privilege and systemic injustice and all of these things that are really important, but how those two things actually will coexist together, I think is going to be really interesting, and media are going to play a huge part in that. So that's my thing to watch this week. And kind of without further ado, I'll pass you on to Stella.
Awesome. Do I start now, Ellie? Yeah, okay,
yeah.
cool.
Take it away.
All right, well, Cool. Okay. Well, talofa lava and warm Pacific greetings, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to share a story about what Bright Sunday and some of our other Pacific media collaborators did to help communicate the very important COVID messages to our Pacific communities. As you all know, where are we now? We're in June and in March, towards the end of March, our country was preparing to go into lockdown, and what was really obvious to me at that point was there was a lot of communication that was being prepared for mainstream audiences, but we were watching to see what was going to be coming out to help inform our Pacific audiences. As a ex-agency person, someone running an agency and ex-public servant, of course I had lots of empathy for my my public servant colleagues who were probably working really hard behind the scenes to pull together the fantastic campaign that they did. And I'd like to acknowledge at this point the all of government COVID campaign team who delivered our national response. And so, you know, knowing the challenges that they would be facing, grappling with, you know, this crisis, working through this complex health situation, I had lots of empathy for that situation, and we knew that they would have not yet gotten to figuring out how they were going to package up their English messages to diverse audiences, let alone Pacific audiences. So we reached out and offered our support to support some of the translation work, because at that time they were preparing some level 3 and level 4 messages while the Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern was considering the lockdown message. As it turned out, the weekend that we sat down with Ministry of Health officials to talk about translations, we happened to be sitting around the table when it was confirmed that that Jacinda would be taking the country into lockdown. And so we spent that whole weekend translating level 3 and level 4 messages, and even as an educated English-speaking person, you know, grappling with some of these concepts, because there were new words and concepts introduced into this. It became acutely aware, like, the importance of communicating the message to our Pacific audiences. Now, at that time, before the level 3 and the levels message came out, at the time, what was circulating was, what we saw circulating was health messages that were related to washing hands, the clinical messages about washing hands and so forth. And we got those messages in the Pacific languages, but there was no language for our Pacific-speaking community about the context. How did this all come about? Why is everyone rushing around buying toilet paper? And so it was very interesting to come home, and we live with my parents, my elderly parents. So it was very interesting to come home and all of us sitting on our devices, scrolling through, catching up with COVID stuff, and mum and dad, who don't speak English, had no idea. The whole world was passing them by. Yet our elderly people and our Pacific communities and Māori communities were most at risk of contracting the COVID. So that weekend, we happened to be sitting around the table, and we pitched this idea to the Ministry of Health and to the Ministry of Pacific Peoples, and we pulled together a consortia of Pacific media, independent media, government-supported media, to package up these messages. And we only had 24 hours to package up these messages before the announcements were made. So overnight, we mobilized 20 speakers, 10 clinicians, 10 faith-based leaders to just take a script, walk into the studio and record these messages, and we were really proud to have packaged these up. Jacinda announced the alerts at 1 o'clock, and within a couple of hours, we had a timely message to deliver to our audience in the 9 Pacific languages, including English. And then off the back of that that event, we were then supported to deliver another 6 episodes, weekly episodes of these languages, of these information to the community every week. So there were 15-minute bulletins. We were able to secure resource with the support of the All of Government campaign to distribute this material, this content through social media, through radio stations across the country, and we were successful in getting our COVID messages out on TVNZ and on mainstream TV, which for Pacific people, notwithstanding that we have some of our Pacific programs, but to hear the message delivered in the language on mainstream TV was an epic and somewhat historic occasion for some of the language groups. So what was the impact of all of this? You know, without going into too much detail because we don't have enough time today, we were successfully able to communicate to our Pacific audiences and deliver the message to them in a timely manner. And we were able to enforce our leaders and our elders essential information that they needed to then inform their families, because compliance was a big part of COVID, the COVID lockdown, and our elders and our faith-based leaders and our community leaders who are more, often non-English speaking needed to be armed with the source of truth direct from Jacinda's office from government, so they could speak confidently and be able to advise our communities. The other important thing why it was important to get these messages out is because there were a whole lot of strange information circulating around on social media, including on the night I got home from editing and the messages, we went down on level 4 lockdown, and our messages, our first lot of messages were going to be delivered the next day. My mum walks into the living room at midnight. I'd just gone home at this point, and she started locking all the windows. And I said to her, "What are you doing?" And she said, "I just heard through radio and someone called me that we've got to lock all the windows because the helicopters are coming tonight to spray the area because of the COVID." So these are the kind of strange myths that were circulating around in the Pacific community on social media. And this is why communicating in the languages, communication was such an essential service during this time. So it was a gift that we were able to do this in the Pacific language, bust the myths. We were also able to evidence that, you know, at a time when everything was being categorized as essential and non-essential, this situation just completely proved how essential languages are. And so I want to say that any content that is made in languages is premium content, and the ability for it to cut through to audiences is been really impactful. Have we showed that 3 slide yet? So this was just to close.
That
I just want, yeah, the yellow one.
This one?
No, the yellow one. Yeah, this yellow one. Yeah. So these were our presenters. We got presenters from all the different languages. So I just want to acknowledge them at this point. And really, at the end, you know. Of the 1,154 cases that were there, Pacific people made up 5% of those cases, and we had 0 deaths. And we feel really proud to have contributed to, through communications and helping our community to get the information they needed at the right time in their languages so they could take the appropriate action. Tawhiti.
Those statistics are like they're incredible, and I know that Stella, you and I first talked maybe a month ago or something, and it's the timing of you joining us today when New Zealand is in level 1, where there are no active cases, and what you've just shared about the success in Pacific communities is like, it's fantastic. It's such an incredible case study. We've now got a good 10 minutes or so for questions, either for Stella or for Ngaire. And so everybody tuning in, please leave your questions in the chat or the questions area, and I'll feed them through. But Stella, I was wondering if you could expand a little bit for me on that translation process. So there's 9 different languages, and one of the things we've talked about in these sessions before is how all of a sudden with COVID, we're all starting to talk about things like herd immunity and your bubble and the different levels. How did things like that suddenly become part of so many different languages?
Wow, that's a great question. And you know, in our line of Pacific communications, or just anything that requires translation, the first thing I want to say is that if you're ever in a position where you're having to translate messages, I always say that we have to translate the English to the simple English and work through the copy so that we can identify metaphors or concepts that are new, like isolation, like the bubble, so that we can give the translator context, because we end up in an awkward situation of literal translations and they don't make sense. So often I bumped into this in creative advertising, where a lot of our ideas in English are creative metaphors or puns or play on words. And yeah, the lesson there is it's best to give the translator the power to come up with the appropriate metaphor or that matches the same meaning. But in the case of COVID, our translators had to scramble because new words were created in this process. And in some cases, for example, on that first day of filming, when we mobilized overnight, we were still translating while people were walking in. The translator was convening their panel of Tongan community language speakers, because people were having to debate and be sure that these messages and these words were right. One interesting example was the Cook Island community, who decided they weren't going to translate the word bubble, but use the Cook Island word for sanctuary to describe the bubble. So there's a couple of examples that are really kind of illustrate the process behind translations, and then add to that crisis and doing it fast.
Yeah. It sounds like an absolutely mammoth amount of work. Just a reminder to everybody tuning in, now is the time to type in any questions that you might have for Stella and for Ngaire. Something that I've been thinking about this week, and I'm curious about both of your thoughts on this one, maybe throwing to Ngaire first and then to Stella. Ngaire touched on what a massive couple of weeks it has been globally for people examining white privilege, white supremacy, the Black Lives Matter movement, and people looking at what that means in their own backyards, whether it's police in Aotearoa or deaths in custody in Australia. And something that I've been wondering about is what do we think the role of the professional communicator is, or a comms person inside an organization? Is there a duty that person has to inform or to push an organization around their role in that kind of social movement? Ngaire, you touched on that a little bit, but I'm curious for your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, I guess my view of communications people in an organization a lot of the time is to be a voice of reason, and is a lot of the time are the conscience of an organization. It's not going to be easy for every organization, but that's why I think expanding the language around what a crisis is, and including social change and social response in that, because at least it will allow you to prep your leaders and the rest of your organization for what things you would want to comment on, what stances you feel like you do have. And I am sure there are a ton of comms people trying to figure that out, and trying to fight for space and trying to make sure that those messages are done in the right way, because that is that's very much what I know of comms people to do.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Ngaire. Definitely from a communications perspective, it is that voice of reason for our marketing colleagues and our advertising colleagues. Like you mentioned before, you know, the opportunity presents itself from a brand perspective to leverage or communicate something meaningful at that time, because consumers are becoming more conscious about these issues, and yeah, it's a real opportunity for people to communicate their stance on it. I mean, the Black Lives Movement is such a massive movement that also has lots of complexity around it too, as well. And if you're not careful, I've seen some terrible communication where maybe some influencers or organizations were attempting to be empathetic, but they were actually offensive. And but it came from a place, a good heart, but they didn't realize it. And that's where I think that whole stance that the Black community is saying around educating yourself to understand will give you the appropriate lens through which you then can walk forward. Yeah.
We've got some thoughts coming through in the chat area about how taking a stance on complex social issues is tricky at best, and it's potentially something that should be led by the CEO. I was wondering where that kind of thinking sits with you both.
I think we know that messages often work best when they are communicated by leadership, and that's very true. I think taking a stance is notoriously tricky. I think one of the big parts about these kind of massive social changes at the moment is that that's no longer the decision of an organisation about whether or not you comment. It's the decision of your audience, and audiences are very much deciding that you need to have a stance. So that's why a lot of what I mean is be prepared to have to do it, because you are unlikely to get a choice.
Yeah, the point in the questions as well as it being led by the CEO is how does that link to an organization's purpose as well? So needing to be authentic and not just opportunistic, which I think you were touching on before as well, Stella.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's an and and an and. I definitely think that the leader of the organization has a role, but I think it's important for everyone within the organization to understand the position and so forth, because whether it's through social media or whether they're at a meeting with stakeholders or at an event, that everyone has I always say everyone has a comms role when they're public facing. So for me, the Black Lives Movement is really an opportunity to reflect also on our relationship with Māori and how we strengthen what we do in terms of just our whole with Māori and diversity here in New Zealand, because those are other. We can't just focus on the Black Lives Movement and not look in our own backyard and address our unique relationship with tangata whenua and the diverse communities that we are blessed to live with in this country.
Yeah, and the same thing. I'm joining you from Australia today, and I know lots of our listeners are in Australia as well. So that we've got just as much richness and thinking to do for those of us tuning in from Australia. Before we finish up, and if you do have any questions for Stella or Ngaire, now is the time. I loved what you said before, Stella, about everybody having a comms role if they're public facing. Tell us more about that. Give us the quick 2-minute version on why you say that, or how you might lead with that in an organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my 15 or nearly 20 years experience, what I've come to know is that there's the traditional channels through which you communicate, like your website, like your events and speeches, but people within your organization are the most important representation of your brand and of your organization. And if they don't understand the vision of your organization, if they don't understand the way that your brand needs to be expressed, then they're doing a disservice, because the sum of all parts all comes together to project an image, to communicate things. So that's what I say. I mean, from the receptionist to the cleaner, everyone has a role.
Yeah, kind of like everyone's role in the bubble and what's been achieved in New Zealand with getting to 0 cases as well, which is fantastic. We have just reached the end of our half an hour, so that is all all that we've got time for today. So thank you so much, Ngaire, and thank you so much, Stella, for your thoughts and a really fascinating case study. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Over the course of the last couple of months, we had been running this webinar series weekly when we were all at home, and the webinars were coming at us thick and fast, and then we moved fortnightly. So from next month, this is something that we're going to move to a more monthly schedule. So I'll be in touch with you all about who we'll be speaking to in July. If you've got any suggestions, or even you yourself have an amazing case study, please reach out. But otherwise, take care of yourselves and enjoy the weekend. And thank you so much for your time. I've had so much fun running this webinar series and catching up with everybody every week. So I've really enjoyed it. Talk to you soon. Thank you. Take care. See ya.
Bye.
See ya.